Alright, today we're going to have a Beyblade discussion, this time on Beyblade Burst balance types. And personally, I think balance types were at their absolute best in Beyblade Burst. This doesn't mean that they're perfect, I mean, nothing's going to be perfect, but so far, they were definitely at their best here. Starting off with single layers, there were only two here, and I think these aren't actually all that good, which is fine. I wouldn't really expect them to start off great, and they kind of fall into the two main problems I see a lot of balance types fall into. And the first of which being Spriggan, which has balance type syndrome, as I like to call it. Basically, it's a balance type that just does nothing. You have some protrusions here on the layer, but they're not big enough to actually be that good for attack. But it also makes the layer too jagged to really be a good stamina layer, and it also just doesn't quite have the bulk to be a defense layer, so it kind of just does nothing in particular, and you don't really want that. Spread is just a fine, neutral disc for really any type. Fusion as a driver, it's okay. The concept itself isn't necessarily terrible. The problem with Fusion is that the actual point here is way too small. It's not big enough to give any real stamina or defense properties, but it's also not going to be aggressive enough to really work for attack. So again, this Bey really just does nothing in particular, and yeah, that's a big problem with balance types. It's too often that we get them and they just don't do much. Neptune is the other weird balance problem, specifically the layer. This thing was used more for stamina defense combinations, being kind of wall-like and fairly round for the time, really not serving much of an attack purpose at all. And yeah, that's the other thing about balance types. When they actually do have a real function, it's because they lean into a specific role and kind of just abandon other stuff. It's generally more of an effective use of a part, but they don't really need to be balanced. I mean, Armed feels more defensive, while Zephyr is more attack-oriented, being more of a whole flat. But if you gave this a stamina or defense driver, it would probably be a more effective combo, but that's just kind of how balance types are. And I think these two work as a good starting point for balance types, both of these single layers being kind of not great. So how do we build on that? Moving into dual layers, we have Storm Spriggan. The layer is very similar to Spriggan, just kind of having balance syndrome. I think Knuckle is just a fine general disc. Then you have Unite. Unite's a weird part. Parts like these tend to be best for defense, as when they get hit around, they hit rubber and won't get knocked out as easily. But if you tilt these things, you could also make a case for attack, as they get started off more aggressive. I'd probably lean more towards defense, but I think balance is a perfectly fair type to give these, and they're kind of a hybrid that does work to some extent. Even if the role tends to be more defensive, I can at least understand balance here. So Unite's definitely a massive upgrade over Fusion, but everything else here is pretty similar to the original. Now we have Nova Neptune. This is a very important Bey. Nova Neptune as a layer, again, kind of just has balance syndrome, doesn't do a whole lot. Has vertical, which is more of a defensive disc. However, Trans is very important, as it was our first real mode changing part in Beyblade Burst. Going from kind of this sharper tip to a flat, and having, yeah, these two different modes, that is kind of the cornerstone of balance in Beyblade Burst mode changes. Because hybrid stuff doesn't really work that well, you generally want to have some kind of specific niche, but when you can actually change your mode, that makes things a lot easier. Even if they don't hit the exact maximum potential of a specific type, being able to shift between good versions of different types is a pretty big deal and does actually work. Trans might not be the best driver out there, but it at least had a role for the time and marks an important shift for balance types, though we won't really see more of that in the dual layer era. I mean, our next one's Inferno Ifrit. What do I make of Inferno Ifrit? It feels like an attack layer. Magnum also is just straight up an attack disc. Liner's a wheel. Yeah, I don't really know what they're going for here with Inferno Ifrit. It feels like an attack type, but I guess the liner was just too weird to count as attack. Yeah, I don't know about this one. Gaigan Gaia is a weird one. The layer itself does look very defensive in my opinion, but I guess it can kind of work as a balance type. But then flipping it over, it has Quarter and Fusion. Quarter has extra weight to one of 4 sides, and the Fusion driver is changed in how it works, as now that it's off balance, it's more likely to be aggressive. It's a pretty cool idea. You can question its effectiveness as a balance type, but I think it's still a good idea, and I don't think everything has to be perfect, so I think it's still a good Bey with a unique idea. But yeah, dual layer balance types I think were a step up from single layers. Storm Spriggan's a little better than Spriggan. Nova Neptune introduces a very important piece. guy is kind of unique. And then Inferno for it, yeah, I don't really know what to make of that one, but overall it's still an improvement. And now we get to Beyblade Burst God. This is where things actually start to improve. Alter Chronos as a layer is nothing too crazy, but it does have a weight shift mechanic that basically has a small piece underneath that can shift to one side or the other. One side making the layer more balanced, the other one making it more unbalanced. Has kind of these wall-like contact points, but still some gaps there. It does function as a mode change, not really a grand one, but still it's something. Then flipping it over, we have 5 Meteor, which is just whatever, but we do have Trans again. So let's just have 4 modes. That's kind of noteworthy. Again, it's nothing crazy, but still, it is adding on to what we already have. Legend Spriggan is just straight up an attack type, the layers attack. 7 can kind of just be used on whatever. Merge, I always felt was more attack oriented. I guess if you wear it down, it's more balance like, but the rubber does kind of just cover the plastic, so a fresh merge, in my opinion, is more attack, but overall, while it is very attack oriented, I feel like it does introduce a very, very important mechanic, that being dual spin. Dual spin will become very important for balance later in the gen. It wasn't at its peak here, but someone had to introduce it. Shelter Regulus is a very, very good example of a good idea but bad execution. The whole idea about Shelter Regulus is that it has these 2 points here that when you launch it, they pop out, act as attack points. However, as the bay loses spin, it becomes more round. That's actually a good balance idea, as it's more attack oriented, but over time becomes more stamina and defense oriented later in the battle to hopefully get a stamina finish. Not bad. But then flipping it over, you do a 5-star, which is perfectly fine, but then there's Tower. Tower starts off much shorter before then getting taller. The problem here is pretty obvious, as while you're trying to become more defensive and stamina oriented, you're then being destabilized by getting taller. It doesn't really work too well. If anything, I actually think that it should start off more defensive in its layer, and in conjunction with Tower, then once it gets taller, it also becomes more chaotic, trying to get like a late knockout or burst. I kind of like the layer as is, but with the Tower gimmick being how it is, I think that it'd be a lot better if the layer had kind of an inverted function to it. It's a weird bay, they tried something, it's kind of cool, but yeah, it probably should have been handled better. Spriggan Requiem is fairly round, but I guess it's still kind of can attack. But it is LR. Because that was generally used more as like a stamina bay, but I think it does shift rolls a bit more than Legend does, being dual spin, so that's kind of cool. Also has rubber, I guess that also kind of works differently, depending on spin direction. At least a little bit. Beyond that though, you do have Zero, which I think just works fine, but then you also have Zeta as the driver. This has 3 different modes. You have this kind of ball-like mode here, then also balance, and then attack. So 3 types there: defense, attack, and balance. Definitely a functional concept for a balance type. Definitely a step up from Legend Spriggan, but we still have ways to go for you to some really, really good balance types. Then we have Duo Eclipse. The layer just kind of speaks for itself. It's half Duo Apollos, half Duo Artemis, the former being a defense type, the latter being an attack type. You split those layers in half, put them together, yeah, it balances the right type there. Very, very unique idea. Maybe not functionally great, but it's cool enough to get away with it. And then flipping it over, 7-star is just fine. Unite, like I said, it kind of does fall somewhere between attack and defense, making enough sense as a balance type, I think, functionally, between all the versions of this bay. Unite was probably the right decision as a driver. This is a really, really cool one. And yeah, Beyblade Burst God, while again we're not at the idealized version of balance types quite yet, I think we make some great steps here. Again, mode changes are becoming more common here, and Beyblade Burst in general was just clearly evolving. And now we get to Chosets. Z Achilles is just straight up an attack layer, that's just all there is to it. Flipping it over, we have 11, which kind of just works for whatever. Extend just feels kind of like another fusion. There is Extend Plus, but we'll get to that later. Aside from that, Extend also does like the height change gimmick, but I mean, who really cares? You know, see Achilles, this thing's just kind of there and boring. Then there's Hell Salamander. Hell Salamander can shift between a 5-bladed and a 10-bladed mode. 5-bladed for attack, 10-bladed for defense. Also has 12, which is just there, I guess, operate. It's a ball that can be kind of offset, which makes it jump around and stuff, making it more aggressive. This thing is a very, very weird bay, but it kind of does work. I think that the whole blade shifting mechanic is actually kind of a huge deal. Like, you have an actual attack mode and defense mode. Again, it might not be top tier attack and top tier defense, but still having that shift I think is actually a pretty good concept. And operate is just funny, I guess. Dead Hades is basically just an attack layer. Then flipping it over, you have 11 turn. 11's whatever, but turn's kind of a big deal as it is flippable. These points here can kind of go with or against the contact points, so it's not as big of a deal because it's a frame, but you do get a little bit more attack or defense out of it, so it is some kind of mode change. Then Zephyr Dash, I mean Zephyr, like I said, more attack. Like this bay again kind of just feels like a somewhat subdued attack type, but whatever, I guess. Then we have Left Apollos and Right Artemis. I'm just going to cover these two at the same time, as they're just the same as like Dual Eclipse, where you take the left half of Apollos, right half of Artemis, put them together, make Eclipse. They really don't have a proper combo because they use Mugen and Mugen L. I believe the anime used like 11 turn Zephyr Dash, same as Dead Hades, but the product just came with those. The layers are a bit upgraded though, as now you can actually choose which core you want, so you can make it left spin or right spin. That's actually a pretty huge deal. So yeah, Eclipse again, but slightly more interesting. Then we have Josie Spriggan. The layer on this thing is very stamina slash defense like. However, it's not as bad when it's LR, because I feel like a large, circular, bulky layer is going to work differently in same spin versus an opposite spin. Yes, opposite spin is generally preferred for these with, you know, equalizing life or death. But you can still use some tanky stuff in same spin and have it work differently. So I do think there is some merit to something like this. Personally, I do find it functionally interesting, but I know a lot of competitive people will just, you know, use it in left spin only, which fair enough for competitive, but for me, I'm just looking at the actual design of these things, and I found the differences to be kind of interesting. Beyond that, you do have Zero Wall, which also does kind of fit with the more defensive theme, I feel. Then you have Zeta Dash, which, yeah, is just Zeta again, but, you know, better spring. So Josie Spriggan, also kind of a weirder one, but fine enough, I guess. And then we have Josie Achilles, which does feel kind of attack-like to me. Also has the burst stoppers, which I forgot to mention on Josie Spriggan, but they're not really that relevant in this discussion, to be fair. Beyond that, you have Double O, which is just kind of there. And then Dimension, the big one here, has a rubber sharp that can be kind of coated by plastic, making it more attack-like. And you can kind of just twist it to make it wherever you want. So it can be more balance-like, or more attack-like, more defense-like. It can just be whatever you want. Also, it has multiple different heights, like a shorter height, medium height, taller height. The idea of Dimension was basically like infinite modes, which is fine. Really, it's just choosing how far you want the plastic sheath to cover the rubber sharp, which technically has like a fine-tune balance mode with multiple variants, or again, as far covered as you can go, basically just being like a plastic hole flat, or the rubber sharp being as exposed as it can be. And again, you also have the 3 heights, so it's a pretty unique driver. Beyond that, I think Josie Achilles is just kind of fine. And yeah, that's Chosetsu. Not the craziest season. I've never been the biggest fan of Chosetsu personally, because in a lot of ways I felt like it was a step down from Beyblade Burst God, but we still have enough positives here, so again, we're continuing to evolve. Moving on to GT. We have Judgment Joker. Again, this just feels like an attack layer. Have the burst stopper right there, the rubber, kind of oval, very much attack. Flipping it over, you do have Double O and Turn. Already talked about both of these. But then you have Trick. Trick is definitely balance-like, though kind of awkward. You have a sharp point, and then these lines here that kind of make it more attack-like, and this thing can kind of just turn however it wants, and then this just moves, which is very odd. This phase weird. Trick is definitely a balanced part, but the rest of the bay is a bit more questionable. I mean, the discs, whatever. I guess Turn's balance as well, but yeah, the layer is definitely more attack-like. Then we have Venom Diablos. The layer just kind of exists, but then you also do have Erase here, so you have 2 different bases. Venom being right, Erase being left. They're not overly interesting parts, but I think having both of them is kind of cool. And then flipping this thing over, you have Vanguard, which just kind of functions. It's fine. And then the driver bullet, which is very odd. It's sort of a semi-flat-ish part, almost coming to a point there a little bit, but the main thing is, of course, you know, this part can pop off, and now it's like this extra mini bay thing here. I mean, it's definitely a special part, but it's generally not that effective. I guess balance is fair enough, but a lot of this thing is just a weird gimmick. Now we got Lord Spriggan. Lord Spriggan, it definitely can work for attack, but I also think it can be somewhat okay for like a stamina defense bay, because it's LR with a lot of rubber. Can equalize if you want it to. So again, LR is helpful for different roles, I think. You also have Blitz, which, I mean, that's kind of attack-like, but it's fine for balance. Then you also have Dimension Dash. Dimension, again, just, you know, better spring. Lord Spriggan, I think, is a pretty good example of a balance type. Yeah, it maybe leans a little bit towards attack, but being LR, I think it does have a bit more of a role with other stuff, which I think is pretty cool. Union Achilles is weird. This thing, basically you take off these like blue parts here if you want, which will make the bay a little bit lighter but also more round, but having them there does add a bit of weight and technically makes it more jagged, so very weird way to go about a mode change, but I mean it works. Then we also have here Convert. Convert is a weight shift gimmick. You can have it be more even or have the weight shifted more towards one side. Again, pretty functional as a balance gimmick. And then also Extend Plus. Finally getting to cover this properly. So there's 3 modes here. You have this mode here, which is more stamina-like, and then this one here, which just pops out a little bit, so more defense-like, and then the last mode being a proper flat, so it's more attack-like. So yeah, this thing, it's a pretty good example of a balance bay. Again, weight shift gimmick makes it either normal and consistent, with the offset one making it more aggressive. Extend Plus has 3 modes. Union can be rounder or more aggressive. It's a pretty good idea. Then we have one of the weirdest bays here, Tap Longness, but also one of the most creative. It's very round, but has these 6 blades that kind of move around. However, it's dependent on the weight. Depending on which weight you have, basically, it'll have these different like stud kind of pieces sitting on different parts. If one of these pairs with a blade, the blade will become fixed instead of, moving around. So basically you can kind of transform how this blade functions depending on the weight. Really, really cool gimmick. I mean, something that transformative does probably make sense for balance. And then flipping it over here, you have, well, 12 expand, which is fine, trans dash, balance. So yeah, a really good example of balance, I feel, but also just a really, really weird bay. Then we have Master Diablos. Master is just kind of a normal balance shape. However, it is LR, and also the base is flippable, which completely changes up how the base will work depending on spin direction, which I think is just a really cool mode change. Then there's also Generate, which didn't need to be like this, but yeah, basically when you first launch the bay, be kind of a flat and then eventually become more of a sharp. Makes enough sense for balance, I think, especially on an LR bay. So yeah, this thing I think gets by just fine. I think GT is the point where we start seeing a lot more interesting stuff. I think LR is becoming more impactful, and gimmicks are generally just getting to a better point, which will continue beyond this season. Now we have Beyblade Burst Super King with King Helios. King is just a weird 5-sided ring, it's kind of just awkward. But the chassis can kind of pair with it or be offset to make it either 5-bladed or 10-bladed, which it's not as effective as something like Hell Salamanders, but it's still a good idea. And then flipping it over, we have Zone, and Zone has sort of a stamina defense-ish kind of point to it with this free spin part, which I guess can kind of counterattack, but yeah, it doesn't really feel like a balance part, but it's fun enough. Usually I don't expect too much from the early season stuff, and yeah, this is no exception. Then we got Death Diablos and Abyss Diablos. I'm just covering these at the same time. Diablos is LR, for some reason has different combos for it. Death and Abyss, they're basically just like these sparking versions of Venom and Ares. That's really all to note about them. I guess Death uses 1 defense, Abyss uses 1 stamina, fine enough, and then flipping them over here, we have the parts. Discs are 4 and 5, that's okay. Death also has turn, which good enough for balance. Then yeah, you have Merge Dash and Fusion Dash, which yeah, I don't know, these things are just like really, really boring. I wish they would have made like an actual Super King Diablos, but instead, nope, we just get whatever these are supposed to be. We pick up after this with World Spriggan, another LR bay, also has a flippable ring. World is very round, also has these points here when pushed in. They act as burst stoppers. This is another bay that kind of works best in opposite spin matchups, but again, it is functionally different depending on if you do opposite spin or same spin, so it's something. And then for the chassis here, we do have, 2 balance, and 2 balance has 2 modes, stationary or free spin, which again, changes things up. Because of the rings design, I think that free spin is generally going to be better for this thing. And then it has Unite Dash, which, yeah, we've already talked about Unite, so overall, fine enough. Maybe not as interesting as Lord Spriggan, but it's not bad. Then we got Infinite Achilles. Infinite can be used on its own and just kind of as a boring, generalized balance shape. However, it has 2 different sub-rings. You have the Infinite Sword, which kind of exaggerates the contact points, making it more attack-like, or the Infinite Shield, which came on this recolor here. That's meant to kind of subdue the contact points, making it more defense-like. Really interesting way to go about a mode change, and I think again they expand this off of Union very well here. Beyond that though, I mean, one balance is just kind of whatever. Get Dimension Dash here, works, we talked about that before. I just think that the Rings mode change is very, very cool from Infinite Achilles. Then we have Helios Volcano. Helios Volcano has a mid-battle mode change because it's, still in a break bay. And having the O-Disc means it happens on the second click. This makes it go from a 5-bladed bait to a 10-bladed bait on the click, which will happen like this. And now you see these extra parts kind of popping out through the top part there. Also the spin is kind of a nice deflection attack sort of thing, I guess you'd say. It's really not the craziest gimmick ever, but it's kind of cool, I guess. And then flipping it over, you have Zone Dash plus Z. This is like very much a stamina driver in my opinion, but I guess it's counted as balance, sure. Still a pretty cool bay overall. Always kind of liked it, but yeah, mid-battle mode changes are kind of weird, but I think it works well enough here, and probably I'd say is the best of the lower break bays. Then we got Death Solomon. This really just exists to give Solomon a proper booster release. The combo itself doesn't really do a whole lot. Death just does nothing. And then 2 Balance does have a gimmick, however, its gimmick doesn't really work properly on most rings. On most of them it's just stationary, and that's how it is on Death. It just sits there, can't free spin. And you have Metal Fusion, which, yeah, I mean, we've already talked about Fusion before, so it's a very whatever bay. It looks very cool, but beyond that, yeah, it's really just a Solomon release. I do feel like Sparking was a bit undercooked, but I can't entirely blame them for this. I mean, the season released starting 2020, and I imagine they had more plans that probably didn't come to fruition because, 2020 production probably wasn't the easiest, so it's still fine for what we got. Probably could have been better, but not bad. And then we have DB/BU, the final line of Beyblade Burst. So starting off with the DB stuff with Astral Spriggan. Astral's kind of just another generalized balance shape. However, it being LR and flippable does give it a couple different rolls. I think it makes it decent. Plus you have like the extra metal, like the rubber and stuff underneath as well, so works fine enough. And then flipping it over, you do have here over, which works fine. But then you have Quattro. Quattro, well, first I have to take it apart because this thing kind of struggles to change modes when put together. But with Quattro, you have a defense mode with a free spinning metal ball, an attack mode with a rubber flat, a stamina mode with like this metal sharp kind of thing, and then a balance mode, which is kind of like a alternate take on Unite. Yeah, this thing does a lot. It's really the most idealized balance driver you could probably think of. I think the blade is just solid enough, but that driver is absolutely insane. And again, probably like the best balance bottom we've ever gotten in Beyblade, at least in relation to the concept of balance. Paredes Raphael is kind of an oddball. It starts off like this, which definitely does leave these protrusions here for, I guess, a little bit of attack, making it kind of a more typical balance type. However, in reality, these parts unlock pretty quickly when locked hard enough, which will make them go upwards and eventually making a halo. I feel like this works better as a stamina type, especially once these things are actually up. It is very round. So I'm not sure why they made this thing balanced, to be honest, but I guess it's kind of fine. I mean, it's a really weird gimmick, so I guess it being that weird and experimental just makes it default balance, but yeah. Flipping over though, you have over, which is okay. Also high extend plus dash. I think the high part does work better with a bay like this, but beyond that, it's extend plus, except, with a better spring. Kind of an odd one, but still really, really cool in its gimmick, even if it doesn't necessarily fit perfectly. And now we get to the BU side of things. Zest Achilles is probably the single best example of balance as a concept ever. It does feel awkward that it was Achilles to do it, but whatever. DB as a system, of course, has high and low mode, just baked into almost every bay. So that's 2 modes for everything, but also this thing is LR. There's 4 modes. The blade itself being flippable, which is really cool, so again, changes up the roll. But also, Zest does have its kind of sub-blade. It can be used without that, which just kind of gives it a general, smaller, vague balance shape that we don't really care about. But when it does use its sub-blade, it can be put on in 2 different ways, basically in the sword mode or shield mode, one of which kind of strengthens its contact points, the other one kind of subdues them, effectively combining the infinite sword and infinite shield into one piece. And between those two and just using it without the attachment in general, that's 3 different ways to use the blade, and then multiplying that with everything else gives you 12 modes for the layer. And then flipping this thing over, you have illegal, which is just kind of fine, but then you have Quattro Dash. So we've already gone over Quattro, but now it has a better spring, and yeah, putting that together with the 12 modes of the layer and these 4 modes of the driver, you have 48 different modes for this bay, which is just kind of unnecessary. But yeah, all these mode changes are actual mode changes though. There's nothing here that's just kind of like a vague slight difference. I mean, high and low mode are pretty impactful. A spin direction change is very impactful. The sub blade makes a difference as well. And then of course, each mode of the driver is reasonably distinct. So yeah, this thing's just absolutely ridiculous and is probably really the magnum opus of what a balance type can be. You could say it's not the best bay ever, which honestly fair, but for this discussion, yeah, it kind of is. Then we got King Helios MR. It's meant to be paired with Super Hyperion MR, of course having the rubber on one side, metal on the other. It's left spin, really just the inverse of Hyperion, so kind of odd. They kind of hover between like attack and balance really, but they can split and be used with each other. It's a cool idea. I think that Giga is a fine disc. Zeal feels more defense-like with kind of being a rubber ball sharp-ish tip. You do have this like weird free spinning plate on the driver as well, but I don't know, this one's just kind of weird. I'm willing to cut it some slack though, because again, it's meant to be paired with Hyperion and a different type, so there's going to be some odd stuff there, but yeah. And lastly, we have Burst Spriggan. Burst Spriggan, fairly round, but it still does have like these attack points and stuff, so it can do different things. Again, it kind of does have balance syndrome a little bit, but it being LR, you have high and low mode, I think it does kind of cover itself decently well there. I mean, you also have like the extra metal, the rubber. I think they make it work well enough by this point in the series, just because it has a lot of options. Though, I do think that, you know, Spread Dash, Fusion Dash, I don't know about this one. Spread Dash is fine, Fusion Dash not really. I get they were trying to go back to like the original Spriggan, but I don't know, I wish they just went like crazy with this thing instead. But it's still a pretty good bay nonetheless, so that's how we unbalance in Burst. And yeah, that's it for DB/BU. These bays just got really, really wild by this point. A lot was being put into each one. And yeah, when you put a lot into a bay, have a lot of mode changes, that just really does benefit balance a lot. And I think is why balance was so good in Beyblade Burst, because, well, it's just great to have a lot of options. That way we don't have to rely on just having boring basic shapes, or just basically making something of a different type, but then just claiming it's something else because, you know, it has like a driver or something that would suggest that instead of defense it's actually balance. So here's the final shot with everything we talked about. Quite a bit actually. I just think balance was the absolute best. I think Box and Shoot had a pretty solid go at it, but I think Burst just did a little bit better. Metal Fight didn't quite have the capability with its system design to really capitalize on something like this, but still did alright. I think Beyblade X has been kind of boring with it. However, I do think Bullet Griffin is genuinely a phenomenal example of what a balance set could be, so maybe some good stuff's coming in the future. I don't know. I just know that Burst did great with it, and I feel like talking about it. So anyway, that's real for the video, so thanks for watching, and bye-bye.